Hello, and welcome to episode 416 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Parrott, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this September the 3rd, Bill?
Well, I'm doing okay, Seth. I came back last night from celebrating my mother's 92nd birthday up in Roanoke, Virginia, and woke up this morning with a sore throat, I'm afraid. And, I thought of saying to you, hey, let's push this back a day. Today's episode is very, very important. We promised our viewers that we would share everything honestly with them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And today's is certainly ugly, but it needs to be said. So many comments recently, Seth, have been, I had no idea. And I think there's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to talk about today where we're going to get people saying, I have no idea that's the way this went down.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the comments are going to, I agree, they're going to be, I had no idea it was that bad.
Right.
I think that's what we're going to see a lot of. And with that, let's get into it. So the use of, and let me just segue this into what we talked about right before we started recording. Last week, if you watched our episodes last week with James Scott, we did an overall strategic, how did you put it, Bill? The plan.
Yeah. Right. The grand strategy of
Thank
why
you.
we were using strategic bombing to defeat the Empire of Japan.
Correct. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was at a loss
Mhm.
for words. You got a sore throat and I'm running a fever, so we're a team of sick human beings here. But point is that we specifically stayed away from mission oriented details in the last episode because you can get down in the rabbit hole with that, and while that's fun and that's what we're going to do today with James, we wanted to give the 40,000, literally actually 30,000 foot view
Mhm.
of how things went down, and we're going to get into the weeds of one specific mission today. But if you want to, and I suggest that you do, watch both episodes or listen to both episodes back to back, 415 and then this one 416, and you'll understand what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So good.
No, I was going to say this is the 8,000 foot view today. So go
Yes, it
ahead.
is. Yes, it is. It is indeed. So the use of incendiary bombs to destroy a city was not a new idea. It had been done before. In 1915, the Germans dropped incendiary bombs on British coastal cities from Zeppelins. In the late 30s, the Japanese used incendiary bombs against Chongqing. In 1940, London and Coventry felt the heat of firebombs. So too did Hamburg, Braunschweig, Dresden, and numerous other German cities during World War II, courtesy of the Royal Air Force. It was not a new thing. City busting raids, that is, of course, air raids launched with one sole purpose, to destroy a city, were also not a new thing. Bomber Harris had been doing it for years in Europe. Entire metropolitan areas in Germany had been reduced to rubble and ash in multiple raids that had been carefully planned by combining predicted dry weather, high winds, and scientific deployment of just the right mix of incendiary and HE bombs to create a man-made firestorm. The desired effect of these raids was multi-purpose. Firstly, by destroying the city itself, or at least a section of it, you would also destroy the manufacturing ability within that area, more than likely, totally. Second, by razing a city to the ground, you would also destroy and severely disrupt the city's ability to function as designed. Third, if the man-made firestorm worked as hoped, it would kill a great many of your enemy. A great many. That very effect was achieved against Hamburg in 1943, and most infamously thus far in the war against Dresden. The United States Air Force, or the United States, had dabbled in firebombing in Europe, but not to the degree of the RAF. The United States Army Air Forces felt that high altitude strategic bombing was the way to go in Europe and the Pacific too. However, recent results over Japan had proven that the Norden bomb site damn sure couldn't put a bomb in the pickle barrel at Musashino. The new commanding general of 21st Bomber Command, Curtis LeMay, had grown weary of inaccurate results from his raids. He'd grown weary of fighting the jet stream over Japan. He'd grown weary of his B-29s and the bombs they dropped being buffeted and pushed all over the sky. With the invasion of Japan and the accountability of hundreds of thousands of American lives resting squarely on his shoulders, LeMay, a dyed-in-the-wool member of the so-called bomber mafia, decided to throw everything he knew out the window. The cigar-chomping general took note of the fire raids in Europe and decided he would try his own on a target in Japan. And not just any target, Tokyo, the heart of the empire. The firebombing raid on Tokyo on the night of March 10th, 1945, codenamed Operation Meetinghouse, would make all the other firebombings look like child's play. Meetinghouse and the firestorm it would create would shake both Japan and the world to its very core. And Bill, I don't think that is in underestimation. I don't know about you.
No, it's not, and remember, we mentioned this last week that, LeMay was caricatured by the media, particularly in the 60s, the cigar chomping, braggarty general. And that's unfair to him. Remember, we talked about the fact that he had Hansen's palsy and he stuck that cigar in his mouth to hide that palsy. And he was a thoughtful guy, and there's good and bad to that. What I'm saying is, he knew exactly what he was doing. There was no stumbling into this. Everything that he's doing, and we'll talk about later how he reacts to some of these things, but everything he was doing is intentional. And since November 1944, B-29s had been bombing Japan. Bombing raids originated out of the Marianas, as we've said repeatedly, and on and off with little to no success. The B-29s under Haywood Possum, Hansel, you remember talking about him last week, had been bombing Japan from high altitude and for the most part completely missing their targets, as you said, Seth. The first raid occurred on November 24th, 1944, to much MacArthur-like press fanfare that turned out to be, fantasy. The raid would target the Nakajima aircraft factory in Musashino, which you talked about already, a suburb of Greater Tokyo. Large by Japanese factory standards, the 130-acre site occupied some 3 million square feet and employed 40,000 people. You would think that's a big enough target to be able to hit with that very precise, I'm putting the word in quotes, Norden bomb site, but no. The raid on Nakajima would occur during the day at high altitude, drawing from experience over Europe. Hansel laid out his first precision strike over Japan like he was planning a mission over Schweinfurt. And how'd that work out, Seth?
Well, it depends. German fighters laid waste, but this particular raid that you're talking about, Bill, did not turn out very, very well. 111 B-29s took off bound for Tokyo on that November 24, 44. After mechanicals, some 88 Superforts made their way to the Japanese capital. Over Tokyo, the high winds beat the B-29s to death. 130-mile-an-hour jet streams pushing both planes and bombs far off target. I used to say that the B-29ers in these days killed a lot of Japanese fish, that they used to make the Japanese fishing industry envious of all the fish that they were hauling in by these errant bombs. It was bedeviled from the start, mainly by Japan's clouds and notoriously fickle weather. It made visual observation for the bombardiers practically impossible, so much so that only 24 of the 88 B-29s that made it to Japan actually bombed the Nakajima target. The remainder hit other targets. All told, despite losing only 2 superforts to enemy fire, the mission was an absolute failure. Post-raid images showed that of the 248 bombs dropped on the Musashino factory, only 48 hit the target, and 3 of those, Bill, were duds. So that was certainly not going to get the job done.
No, so we got to do some follow-up raids, right? Well, the follow-up raids on the same target were all completed with the same results, failure. By the end of 1944, the B-29s had raided Japan over a dozen times from the Marianas, and with the exception of one raid, had failed to do any serious damage to the targets they attacked. In early January 45, Haywood Possum Hansel was fired as commanding general of the 21st Bomber Command. His replacement was the person we've been talking about for a couple of weeks now, Curtis LeMay. After tinkering with the command structure, retraining his aviators, we spoke about that last week. and practicing raids all over the Blue Pacific, LeMay set out to improve, that wasn't hard to do, on Hansel's record with the B-29. There was nowhere to go but up. However, initially, LeMay did no better than his predecessor. LeMay's high-altitude precision strikes were anything but. They were high altitude, but not precision. Despite dropping his 29s from 30,000 feet to 25,000 feet in an effort to avoid the jet stream, the high Japanese winds, his bombers were no more accurate than Hansel's missions had been. So of the 646 sorties LeMay had initiated, some improvements were made to accuracy, but generally the results were mixed and usually bad. The Japanese weather still confounded the vast majority of raids. So with pressure mounting on LeMay, directly from Hap Arnold, who wasn't very happy right now, he knew that he had to get results out of his 29s, his superforts. LeMay decided that a drastic change had to occur to both American tactics for strategic bombing and change to the morality of how we're going to fight. Now that has ominous, that's pretty ominous sounding, Seth.
It is. And we went into this last week, but we can touch on it briefly again here. The US AAF, United States Army Air Forces, which, by the way, this is a pet peeve of mine. People often try to correct, saying it was Air Corps. No, it wasn't. In 1941, the term was changed from U.S. Army Air Corps to U.S. Army Air Forces. So just so everybody knows. We prided ourselves on this high altitude precision strikes that we talk about, when we did our Masters of the Air stuff, Bill. We were talking about, bombing Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin, whatever, from, 28,000 feet with B-17s and B-24s, even though it wasn't incredibly accurate by any means, although there were some raids that were very accurate. That's what we did. We didn't indiscriminately bomb civilians, although there were times where we did. Munster, October 10th, 1943, specifically. Regardless of this, we were not ones to sit out there and area bomb cities with incendiaries. That's not what we did. Occasionally they did do it in Europe, but not to the extent of the RAF. And I'm not, demonizing the RAF. Bomber Harris did his own thing, and he's a guy that, frankly, well, whatever. But anyway, it was a tactic that the United States Army Air Forces did not want to adopt. But as we shall see, changes had to be made, and it all started from the top. So incendiary raids on European cities specifically resulted in a mixed bag of success. In high cluster areas, most of the target was burned, but European cities, often constructed of brick and stone and hard to burn items like that, were more resistant to firebombing than Japanese cities. Now, that's not to say that cities didn't burn, because of course they did, but not to the extent that we're going to see in this episode. Incendiary raids are only successful if the target will burn. And the intent of a fire raid wasn't merely to burn a building. The intent of a massive fire raid was to create a man-made firestorm. A firestorm, if created perfectly, could and would be absolutely devastating. The first firestorm of World War II had been unleashed on Coventry in 1940 by the Germans. 450 Luftwaffe bombers dropped 56 tons of incendiaries on the town, as well as 500 tons of explosives, that's HE. Over 200 fires of various sizes burned in Coventry, all converging into one massive fire that destroyed 3/4 of the city's factories and buildings, killing some 550 Britons. Deemed a success by the Luftwaffe, Coventry was a pittance to what would follow. In response to Coventry and fire attacks on London, the RAF hit Hamburg with a fire raid that created a firestorm in 1943, July 43. 720 RAF bombers set Hamburg ablaze, killing an astonishing 45,000 German men, women, and children. More fire raids that created firestorms would follow on Kassel, Darmstadt, Braunschweig, and Heilbronn, among others, throughout 1944. Dresden, which had been bombed over a period of 3 straight days, was ravaged by several firestorms that swept through the city, killing an estimated 25,000 people, Bill.
Yeah, so that's 45,000 in one raid and
Correct.
25,000 in the famous Dresden raid, which is amazing. Unlike Europe, though, where cities were made of brick and stone, the Japanese cities, as we've said many times, were made of paper and wood. It was widely known among American military planners that Japanese cities, specifically Tokyo, were vulnerable to fire. If a firestorm could be created, the vulnerable city would indeed burn and burn well. So here we're going to get into some stuff that I don't think the average lay historian really has great insight into. So I hope this is illuminating. In 1923, Tokyo was struck by a massive earthquake on the 1st of September, to be precise. It was called the Great Kanto Earthquake. At the time, it was considered the worst natural disaster ever to strike quake-prone Japan. It leveled Tokyo. The initial jolt was followed a few minutes later by a 40-foot-high tsunami. We had another one about, just a decade or so ago in Japan, but not this high. A series of towering waves swept away thousands of people. Then came the fires, roaring through the wooden houses of Yokohama and Tokyo, the capital, burning everything and everyone in their path. The death toll would be about 140,000. Let that sink in, including 40,000 who had sought refuge near Tokyo's Sumida River in the first few hours, only to be immolated by a freak pillar of fire known as a dragon twist. In American parlance, a firestorm. As the war progressed, American planners began to draw up plans to do what the Great Kanto earthquake did, kind of accidentally, but to do that on purpose, to burn Japanese cities to the ground. Roof designs in Tokyo were studied, apartment buildings were studied and replicated. Believe it or not, we built Japanese cities in the Utah desert, much like we did decades later, where we built mock Afghan cities in places like, all over the country. But those Japanese cities in the Utah desert, we subjected to American incendiary bombs. Block after block of mock Japanese cities were built, exactly replicating the actual thing, down to the interior. Mats, futami, cribs, sliding screen doors, and so on. So over the course of the summer of 1944, these mock cities were burned over and over again to see which combination of incendiary and high explosive bombs were going to work and what were the perfect way to incinerate a city. And while the test was completed in 44, the thought of burning Japan to the ground was an idea hatched as early as 1932 by Billy Mitchell. What is thinking about this in 32, Seth?
Yep. I mean, that was kind of surprising to me when I read that. I've been studying this my whole adult life, and when I read that, and I checked the sources, and it is very, very legitimately true. I even sat there and went, "Damn, that's very early indeed." So Billy Mitchell remarked on Japanese cities and their mostly wooden construction. He said, and I quote, "These towns form the greatest aerial targets the world has ever seen," unquote. Those are Billy Mitchell's words. As one report noted, quote, "With the villages constructed and furnished, initial testing," that we're talking about Utah now, "initial testing of the incendiary weaponry began on May 17th and ended on July 16th, but additional tests were conducted in 1944 to refine the M69 into cluster bombs. In total, the structures were destroyed and completely rebuilt at least 3 or 4 times. Planes dropped a variety of bombs on the structures, including the M50, the M52 thermite-based bomb, as well as the M69 napalm-based bombs." So you can see, as Bill was saying, and hopefully we're proven, is that we were testing things, not just how to burn the city, but the exact right scientific combination of incendiaries to burn Japanese cities to the ground. A model of Tokyo was also built at Eglin Air Force Base near Fort Walton Beach, Florida, not too far from here. Conventional wisdom said that in order to destroy a city, it should be first bombed with high explosives, and then the debris could be ignited with incendiaries. This is what they were doing in Europe for the most part. But Arnold's tests, Hap Arnold, proved otherwise. Instead, it was found that the use of small napalm bombs, i.e., M69s, would ignite the buildings and the fire would spread rapidly, creating an enormous fire that would quickly spread uncontrolled throughout the heart of the city. The mechanics of manufacturing a firestorm were well understood in the headquarters of Curtis LeMay, Bill, but the weather had to be absolutely perfect, didn't it?
It did, yeah. So, I mean, that makes sense what you just said. In Europe, where you've got a stone building, you want the high
Sure.
explosive to kind of expose the wood fuel behind the stone. But in Japan, you didn't need to do that. There was no stone. The fuel was already sitting right there out in the open. The weather in Tokyo made the city ripe for fire because the winds and things like that would just, accelerate. It was like a natural accelerant. So for the last 45 days, the temperature in Tokyo had failed to climb above freezing when Curtis LeMay is looking at all of this. Snow had fallen recently, but the freezing temperatures had kept the snow from melting, thus preserving the dry conditions throughout the city. The winds in Tokyo on March 45 had been whipping through the city. The high winds blowing through the tightly packed buildings dried out whatever wood had managed to get wet during the freezing days and nights. It's actually the thawing, right? Everybody knows that when you go outside and it's really cold, your sinuses dry out. Cold means the air is going to be very dry. It's the melting when it warms up that's going to cause things to get wet. By March 9th, 1945, Tokyo was a tinderbox waiting to be lit. Now here, weary of the lackluster results of high-altitude bombing over Japan, LeMay decided it was time to shake things up. Experimental fire raids on Japan had been unleashed in November, much to Ponsam Hassel's dismay, and we talked about that last week, and again in January. The results on a small portion of Tokyo and Osaka had proven to LeMay that firebombing would work on Tokyo if he could get his B-29s on target. In quick succession and in a tight area, all of these things occurred. His bombers could and likely would start the firestorm he knew he needed to destroy the targets that had evaded him since January. Now, I want to say one thing before we move on. This science, and it is, believe it or not, it is a science
Absolutely.
of how to destroy things with bombs. That science is called weaponeering. And so we do this with every one of our weapons. We model explosive effects. In this case, we're going to model the incendiary effects and then calculate. There's actual calculations that go on here as to how dense the pattern has to be and things like that. We're going to talk a little bit later, but there is a geek on Curtis LeMay's staff. This geek later became Secretary of Defense, but this geek's job was to analyze the results that were being discovered in the Utah desert and try to replicate those, optimize the destructive potential of these, through mathematics. Yeah, they actually did this stuff. And then make sure that the planning, the weaponeering that went into Curtis LeMay's Tokyo strikes were perfected. And I actually met this geek that we'll talk about later. Is people figuring out who he might be? When I escorted him to the Korean War Memorial dedication in D.C. around about 1996, I think it was. I was this geek's escort. And with that, I'm handing it back to you, Seth.
Little hook there. Bait the hook.
Yeah.
So Japan, we talked about this last week, but we'll get into it a little bit more today. Japan's cottage industry of manufacturing was well known to 21st Bomber Command in 1945. Japanese industry by 1945 had spread out about the inner cities like a spider's web. Big targets like the Musashino factory that had been thus far targeted no less than 12 times and still hummed were ripe targets, to be sure, but so too were the smaller industries spread around the city that made smaller parts for the bigger factory. Many of these smaller industries were buried deep inside of Tokyo's suburbs, inside and directly next to block after block of apartments and houses. LeMay counted these smaller targets as just as important as the bigger ones, and it makes perfect sense. By smashing these smaller targets, it would also put a hit on the bigger targets. Sandwiched inside the burbs meant that innocent people would have to die. The fact was not lost on Curtis LeMay, who infamously said, quote, "You've got to kill people. When you kill enough of them, they stop fighting," unquote. LeMay took those words very, very seriously. He knew that if his B-29s could execute a fire raid and create a firestorm that would kill thousands of people, the will of the Japanese citizenry just might break, or at the very least, begin to bend. And that just may bring the war closer to an end and thereby save lives on both sides by canceling an invasion of the home islands. Now, to be 100% clear, LeMay was only concerned about American lives. I'm going to put that out there right now. But in the end, invading the home islands, there is no question. We've talked about this ad nauseum, and we're going to do it again as we get closer to the end of the war, would have cost hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. But before any of that happened, his planes had to get to Tokyo to burn it down. That meant he had to get not only bombers, but bombs on target at the same time without disruption. Time for something new here, Bill.
Yeah, and this is new. Boy, oh boy, is it
Big time.
new.
Big time.
Think about melee in the air. Early in March 1945, LeMay hatched this crazy plan for a knockout blow against Tokyo. He would send his B-29s in low. By low, do we mean 15,000 feet? Do we mean 12,000 feet? No. His bombers would be stacked at altitudes between 5 and 8,000 feet, a full 20,000 feet lower than they had been trained to fly and fight. The lower altitude, he hoped, would cause much less drift on the bombs due to that strong wind. And by having to compensate for less drift, he has a higher chance of being able to get the bombs on target. And it would put less strain on the B-29's finicky engines, thereby allowing his more prickly bombers the chance to reach the target without mechanical difficulty. The lower altitude would also allow the B-29s to carry more bombs and use less fuel. Also a bonus, flying low would put the B-29s below the jet stream, thereby eliminating the frustrating issues of inaccuracy. As I said, but here's the kind of really crazy part of his plan. Tokyo's AAA could potentially be murderous. Some 600 AAA guns guarded Tokyo, as well as 300 fighters. Members of LeMay's staff estimated that the American casualties over Tokyo could exceed, get this, 70%. That could be in excess of the 2,000 American airmen who would be lost during this raid. That was an unrealistic risk to LeMay, so he decided to try another new trick. His B-29s would fly 5,000 to 8,000 feet over Tokyo at night. American heavy bombers had almost never flown over an enemy target at night in either theater. It's hard to navigate, it's hard to do everything. It's hard to see and prevent air-to-air collisions. Daylight precision bombing, that's what the Army Air Forces was all about at the time. Not anymore. The cover of darkness, he hoped, would render the Japanese capital's AAA defenses toothless. If you can't see the airplanes, you can't shoot them. Night fighter attacks wouldn't work either. While they might see some exhaust plumes on the B-29's engines, that's a lot harder to detect than there would be at daytime. It would be less frequent based on the fact that he would also catch the Japanese by surprise because they were not expecting a nighttime attack. The risk was tremendous, but to LeMay, if things went well, this could be the knockout punch to bring the war to Japan. The punch the B-29, frankly, he thought was designed to deliver. The punch straight in the mouth to the home island, Seth.
Yeah. And as we're going to see, he was 100% right. On March the 6th, 1945, LeMay held a meeting with his top men on Guam. In that meeting, he explained his plan. His staff listened with jaws on the floor. They had never heard anything like this before. He said, quote, "I'm going to send you in at 5,000 feet without guns, gunners, or ammunition," unquote. Rosie O'Donnell, who we talked about last week, who was his tempestuous mission leader more often than not, only whistled when he heard the plan. Yeah, indeed. LeMay's decision to remove ammunition and guns was an effort to lighten the ships so they could carry more bombs. He also figured that the 29ers wouldn't be shooting at too many Japanese aircraft at night either. The room was somber, to say the least. Many of LeMay's wing leaders thinking that the mission was absolute suicide. The following day, the orders were cut for more than 300 B-29s, nearly all of LeMay's force at hand, to fly in at 5,000 feet under radio silence. Beginning at 1730, the B-29s would take off from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam and fly towards the Empire. To avoid collisions, the wings would fly at staggered altitudes, hence the 5,000 to 8,000 foot gap we have. The first squadrons over the target would act as pathfinders for those that followed. These B-29s would carry M47 incendiary weapons so as to ensure, quote, "good penetration and initial fire spread of sufficient size to tie up the enemy's firefighting equipment and increase the potential effectiveness of smaller bombs to be dropped by later planes," unquote. Coming in about 30 minutes before the main wave of B-29s, the Pathfinders were to drop their loads at precisely 0015, that is 12:15 a.m., approaching their target area at right angles to each other. The Pathfinders would ignite the area in the shape of an enormous fiery X. This time, Bill, X most definitely marks the spot.
Yeah, Seth, I'm reminded of when we did our Masters of the Air series that, the B-17 pilots, crews, not just pilots, we talked about had a pretty high mortality rate.
They did.
And I would imagine that in the Pacific, the bomber crews were thinking, yeah, I'd rather be here than there because it wasn't so bad yet.
Yeah.
And then this comes, right? And news about this happening. That's, they're thinking, well, I guess this is our come up. And so I guess that's the way they would have thought about it.
They weren't happy about it.
No, no, no. And the target area, known as Incendiary Zone 1, was a highly flammable area known as the Sitamachi. Roughly 3 by 4 miles, the nearly 12 square mile area spanned the heart of the city's cottage industry and government areas. While the factories and sub-factories were the legitimate targets, they were not the true targets at all. LeMay knew what the true targets was. Intel told him that 95% of the structures in this area were made of wood, mostly two-story buildings. The area is full of kindling, obviously, but even those structures weren't the real targets. Those who lived in the structures were the targets. The pre-mission intel stated employment at scores of war plants throughout Tokyo and environs would be directly affected by casualties, movement of workers out of the area, use of manpower and reconstruction, and probably lowered morale. Boy, that's putting it mildly. Over 87% of the target area was classified as residential. The population in the area was estimated to be 1.1 million. It was 135,000 people per square mile. So we're talking about a 12 square mile target area times 135,000, 1.1 million people were targeted. And it was not just the killing of those people, but the secondary and tertiary effects of those people dying that he was thinking of, Seth.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's thinking about the long-term effects here for sure. When they began their takeoff roll, many B-29 crew members believed that their humorless, cigar-chomping commanding general, Curtis LeMay, was sending them to die. Not sure they were wrong, LeMay spent the early evening hours watching B-29s take off from Guam and fading daylight. He told his public affairs officer, St. Clair McKelway, quote, "If I am sending these men to die, they will string me up for it," unquote. LeMay later told aide Lieutenant Colonel Robert S. McNamara, quote, "I was under pressure from people who didn't want a change in the way we were doing things. I felt I had to ignore them and take a chance," unquote. Bill, there's your
Yeah, there's the geek. Yeah,
there's the geek.
yes, that is the Robert McNamara, President Kennedy and President Johnson's Secretary of Defense, who I did get to escort to the Korean War Memorial dedication in '96. But he was a business analyst, and he was analyzing the death of these Japanese as if it were a business process. That was his job in all of this, working for Curtis LeMay, Seth.
Yeah. So the Tokyo mission was in the air. They quite literally were in the air. Of the 334 aircraft that took off from the three islands that I just mentioned, 279 were going to make it all the way, while the remainder aborted for technical reasons, whatever case it may be. There was no formation. And again, think about what we were talked about at Masters. When we did Masters, you get these huge formations of B-17s and later B-24s, and even over Japan, you get these huge formations of B-29s. This ain't happening here. Each aircraft was on its own. Its airplane commander entrusted with the souls on board, its navigator and his special skills never more important than now. The Pathfinders were way out in front, with most of the bomb groups from Guam coming next, having taken off early enough to overtake the super fortresses from Tinian and Saipan. The mission's leader, Brigadier General Thomas Power, we're going to talk about him again here in a little while. His 314th Wing from Guam was assigned to approach Japan flying between 5,000 and 5,500 feet. Rosie O'Donnell's 73rd Wing from Saipan was to fly between 3,000 and 3,500 feet. Of course, he's going to stack it up higher than that, while Brigadier General John Davies' 313th Wing on Tinian was to make the long journey to the Empire at 4,000 to 5,000 feet. And again, they're going to crank it up too. The separation of bomb wings by height above a dark and cruel sea was the best hope of preventing air-to-air collision. And in fact, Bill, none occurred.
That is amazing. And these guys have to think, when did I join the Navy flying over this much ocean? And by the way, I just looked it up. I was going on memory when I said the Korean War Memorial dedication was 96. And of course, I got it wrong. It was 95. But back to the story. Anyone familiar with precision daylight bombing formations in Europe? Stepped, spaced, boxed, aerial assemblages, very tight formations of bombers proceeding together in book-like unison, they would have believed that LeMay's entire B-29 force had lost all sense of discipline, or even common sense. Perhaps the men at the controls of these planes were completely mad. This is what I meant when I said earlier, airborne melee, because that's what this would have looked like. A B-29 gunner recalled, "Occasionally on a night, I would look out my blister at the ocean down below, and it would look like we were passing over a series of connected superhighways with lights. What I was observing were lines formed in the currents of the fluorescent sea life. It was eerie, not in a comforting way, but in a very troubling way." Mm-hmm. The general in command of thousands of bomber crew members was alone in his Quonset headquarters, but for St. Clair McKelway, who was the PAO we spoke about earlier, who had become a confidant and who had been told to wait to hear the bombs away message expected in early morning. LeMay and McKelway exchanged small talk. Neither was good at it. Both felt the tension as they awaited news from Tommy Power at the cutting edge of the attack force. And so it's really hard to determine whether this attack really was weighing on LeMay. He kind of didn't give much indication of it, but of course he was trying not to give any indication of it. LeMay talked of his wife and child back in Cleveland. This was out of character. McKelway wrote that LeMay had no life beyond the games of medicine ball to keep fat off a body that tends to be fat, which was LeMay. And I remember the medicine ball when I was in elementary school. I'm not sure it works. Games of poker to relax as best he can. to relax as best he can, a mind that actually never stops thinking about how to do the job better the next day. And he did do a little reading, mostly fairly serious reading. Trying not a way to lighten up the mood, is it? But he was always trying to improve his mind, a mind that he considered inadequate. And so he had these insecurities that are really amazing when you think about the decisiveness that he used to conduct this fight, Seth.
Yeah, he's an absolutely fascinating American figure because, like we talked about last week, Possum Hansel, the guy that he replaced, was a Southern gentleman. He came from, an aristocratic background in the South, just deeply rooted in that deep Southern society, of which, by the way, this Southerner ain't. I'm just saying. But Possum Hansel was, he was an officer and a gentleman. Not to say that LeMay wasn't a gentleman, because he was, but LeMay came from a hard scrabble youth in Ohio. He had a tough life. He was a completely self-made man. And even though he was brilliant, he considered himself to be, a dullard. I don't want to say stupid, because he didn't think he was stupid, but he considered himself to be less than adequate in terms of intelligence when compared to other people like Possum Hansel. But he was quite the opposite of that. And to your remark about how concerned was he, I think he was absolutely, for this mission specifically, maybe not others, but for this one specifically, I think he was like a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Like, he could not relax because of the fact that this was his call. And we made that point last week. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
No, what I was going to say, but this is 12 o'clock high style concern.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's concern over your aviators, not concern over the death and destruction he's about to bring to bear. Go ahead.
No, you're 100% right. No, this is Gregory Peck 12 o'clock high concern for sure. This is, am I going to lose 2,000 guys tonight? Because that's what his intel people were suggesting that he could possibly lose, with or without the darkness, the cover of darkness. He was saying, this might be the end, A, of my career, B, of 2,000 plus guys that wear an American uniforms lives tonight. So his concern, I think, for this was very, 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 very genuine. With midnight approaching and the first Pathfinders due over the Japanese capital, a curious kind of loneliness bonded McElway and LeMay. McElway sensed it was as if there was no difference in rank between them. Quote, "We won't get a bombs away for another half hour," LeMay said, looking at his watch. "Would you like a Coke? I can sneak in my quarters without waking up the other guys and go get 2 Cokes, and we can drink them in my car. That'll kill most of the half hour."
Let me jump on that, Seth, because think about how remarkable that is. He's sleeping in a tent with other guys.
Yes.
And this is why he razzed the Navy so bad with Nimitz and his very nice house and his choker whites, having cocktails before dinner, right? These guys are living very, very austere lives on these islands.
Yeah, Spartan
and
conditions.
The commanding general has roommates. Go ahead.
Yeah, he does. So LeMay and McElway drove about 100 yards to LeMay's tent in LeMay's staff car. He did sneak in and got a couple of Cokes, and he said, quote, "We sat in the dark facing the jungle that surrounds the headquarters." McElway wrote this. He said, "2 men, no rank between them now, pulling on the 6-ounce Cokes and knowing that within a very short time, the 1,000 kids, as they called them, would be arriving over the empire." As the raiders approached Tokyo, and I'm not talking about the Doolittle Raiders, we're talking about these raiders, many tuned into the local Japanese radio station. We talked about this a couple episodes ago when Spruance raided Tokyo. They were tuning into NHK, the Japanese main radio station in Tokyo. That's how they knew that they were approaching unseen. Same thing here. NHK radio, when they didn't play patriotic Japanese martial tunes, and this is honest to God, I'm not making this up, would occasionally play American songs. Airmen aloft that night in the B-29s reported hearing the ironically titled songs, again, I swear to God, I'm not making this up, "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes" and "My Old Flame," being broadcast from NHK studios. Talk about spooky and eerie, Bill.
That is spooky. I know the first song, but I don't know the second one. I'm going to have to Look It Up When We're Done Here, Seth, My Old Flame.
Mhm.
Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is an old classic,
Mhm.
continued through the 60s, but my goodness. So roaring in closer to shore, the Japanese picket boats spotted, or at least heard, the B-29's approach. Yeah, I think you could hear a couple hundred airplanes
Yeah.
flying at 5,000 feet. I don't think that's a hard thing to do. Light AAA went up and some tracer fire, but the B-29s pressed on, ignoring the nuisance. It was random. I'm reminded of those videos of Baghdad, right, and
Mhm.
the night bombings when we sent the first cruise missiles in, and the tracer fires going back and forth blindly and randomly across the sky. That's what it must have looked like here. Air raid sirens inside Tokyo blared, but few paid any mind to the wailing sirens. I guess they were kind of used to them by now.
Yeah.
Radio reports had made note of enemy aircraft orbiting Chosi, a port city 50 miles away. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, that was a rally point for the B-29s. Beneath the 29ers, Tokyo lay cloaked in darkness. Blackout regulations were in strict force, and nothing could be seen below the Pathfinders except the faint outline of a coastline. As the Pathfinders, remember, these are the ones who are going to drop that cross-shaped fire pattern so that the other B-29s would use as a target. They were now crossing the coast at their assigned points, and they got farther inland. Then the radar and radar operators inside the airplanes were able to pick out their assigned target area. At first, as the first Guam-based Pathfinders screamed across Tokyo Bay, a bay I've driven up and down dozens of times, the bomb doors opened. As the plane crossed the Arakawa River, the bombardier dropped their payload, and the M47s tumbled out of those Pathfinder B-29s over the Fukugawa district of Tokyo. And I've been there a bunch of times too, Seth.
Mhm. On the ground below, civilians could hear the approaching roar of engines. I mean, again, like you said, Bill, how can you not? Tokyo had been bombed before. We've said this, multiple times. They'd been bombed at high altitude during the daylight, and they had endured a fire raid earlier. But only one time had they been bombed at night, and not by many American aircraft. Japanese coast watchers heard the approaching bomber formation around midnight. Initially confused by the sound of so many aircraft approaching so low, they hesitated to report the sound of the impending attack until well after the initial B-29s had flown over them. By then, it was too late. The 29ers were already there. The initial M47s burst as they hit the ground just barely 2 minutes after the first bombs away. Blazes were roaring in the southeastern portion of the target area. Minutes later, blazes erupted in the Johto ward, then the Hanjo ward to the north. At that precise moment, the winds inside these wards and all across Tokyo, to be honest, picked up. Gusting between 15 to 30 miles an hour, the winds quickly fed the fledgling fires that, as prescribed, soon burned a massive, terrifying X on the ground below for the remaining B-29s to find. Civilians below and in areas not yet touched by the fire, or by the raid, I should say, still slept. The air raid siren that finally went off at 12:15 a.m., a full 7 minutes after the first bombs fell. Those on the ground woke up and started grabbing whatever they could pack into a backpack, donned an air raid hood, and went outside. Some went for their homemade air raid shelters. Others moved in a herd towards supposed safety, mainly towards the river. As young children came out of their homes, they saw the glowing red sky that seemed to be inching closer to them and remarked, quote, "How beautiful that is," unquote. Bill, the red sky would grow even redder within minutes.
Yeah, it's not going to be beautiful for long.
Mm-mm.
As Brigadier General Powers' B-29s roared in over the coast, their bomb bays opened and spilled the deadly M69 Incendiary, the main weapon for the night, from their cavernous holds. The E-46 incendiary bomblets would rain down on Japan like giant firecrackers. They came in bunches of 47 small bomblets called M69s, strapped together inside a metal cylinder, fused to break open at 2,000 to 2,500 feet, so these little M69 bomblets would scatter. These 3 to 5 seconds after the big firecrackers hit, they would go off. An explosive charge would violently eject a sack full of gel, this is the napalm bit, that would burn intensely. The sack held the gel in one spot, thereby igniting a hotter fire. As the M69s burst open and the smaller fires landed, they clung to anything and anyone they landed on. Overhead, Brigadier General Power circled the city as B-29, marking each new fire on his map with a red grease pencil. He later said, "I watched block after block go up in flames until the Holocaust," yes, that's the word he used, "had spread into a seething, swirling ocean of fire, engulfing the city below for miles in every direction," unquote. Nearly 10 tons of incendiaries fell on the city below on average each minute. 10 tons each minute of the raid. The bomblets of the M69s crashed through tiled roofs of homes, shops, and schools. As they hit the floors or walls, they spilled jellied, flaming gasoline on the walls, tatami mats, mattresses, kitchen tables, and everything in between, people, whatever. The fires quickly spread, bringing the smaller blazes together into larger ones, and then even larger ones. B-29ers in the rear of the massive formation would later remark that they didn't need any navigator. The glow from the fires in Tokyo could be seen upwards of 90 miles out to sea. The following waves of silver bombers came under the attack of Japanese searchlights. Arcing into the night sky, the lights would fixate on a B-29 so the AAA could open fire. Tonight, however, these B-29s mostly made it away before the AAA could open fire. Seth, I understand that the fire was so intense that there were scorch marks on the bottom of some of these airplanes when they returned back to the Marianas.
Absolutely. Yeah. They were like soot and everything that was underneath the engine nacelles. There were guys who, when they landed, their ground crews got in, started to, perform maintenance on the engines, and they were finding pieces of Japanese like tatami mats and paper and pieces of wood and everything that had been created by the thermal updrafts from the fires that got stuck in the engine nacelles of the B-29s. And that's something I didn't put in the notes, but it's 100% true, is that the updrafts created by this firestorm that we just, spoiler alert, as you always say, that we're going to create, actually caused some of the B-29s in the flight to become inverted. It flipped the B-29s over. And if you've ever seen a B-29 in real life, with your own two beady eyes, that is a big airplane. That is not an F-4F Wildcat. That is a large piece of machinery. That is a big ass bomber.
Yeah, they jokingly referred to them as aluminum clouds.
Yeah, I mean, it's some friggin' big airplane. And for the winds to go and flip that thing on its back, that is some serious, serious power that this storm that we are going to create actually possesses. So the AAA grew in intensity as the B-29s came on and on and on, and several were taken down by enemy fire, but the majority did escape. Airmen who came in the later waves stated that it was, quote, mind-boggling to see so much fire, unquote. It was like looking into the mouth of hell, said one. A Boston Globe reporter flying in a B-29 named Patches said, quote, "I not only saw Tokyo burning, I smelled it," unquote. As the bombers passed over the target area and opened their bomb bay doors to unleash their payload, many of the crews were met with a sickening odor. Maynard David, a bombardier, recalled that, quote, "When the bomb bay doors opened, the plane filled with smoke from the ground, and we smelled this horrible odor. We closed the bomb bay doors after we dropped and headed to sea. The odor was still so strong in the plane that the pilot ordered me to open the doors again to let fresh air in. You can only imagine what was going on down below us," unquote. The odor, of course, was the smell of burning human flesh. Such were the casualties on the ground that the smell would permeate the airplanes and the flight suits of the crews for days after the raid. Half an hour after the first bombs fell, the Tokyo Fire Department declared defeat. The fires were out of control. As they said, as the fire department said, hellfire was upon us. So, Bill, as the sky over the target became superheated, and it quite literally did, massive amounts of air were sucked upwards, draining the area of cooler air from the ground level to feed the fires. This is how this firestorm that we desired to create was actually started. Take us through what happens next.
Yeah, and again, this part, of course, was not predicted. You know, when you look back at McNamara's calculations and all of that, there's certain things you can model, and then there are certain things you can't model. And this had an atomic bomb-like effect with this updraft, but it only can be created with a massive, massive fire, which we couldn't do for real in the Utah desert. So as more and more ground air was sucked up, the fires grew and spread. The fire fed upon itself, consuming everything in its path. The winds created by the firestorm turned into cyclonic winds. This is the bit that was surprising. Breeding updrafts that sucked the oxygen out of the air, asphyxiating those who weren't burned were asphyxiated to death, right? The massive amount of carbon monoxide released by the raging fires, it's not asphyxiation, that's poisoning, claimed thousands of victims as the fire grew. So you've got the sucking the oxygen out, asphyxiating effect. You've got the carbon monoxide and dying from poison, inhaling poisons effect. And of course, you've got the burning effect.
Sure.
This is, you know, a dark, dark science going on here. The depletion of air at the fire center created the vacuum we spoke about earlier. The fresh oxygen pulled into the fire exploded the intensity level. The rush of air pulled into the vacuum created this firestorm with winds approaching 70 miles an hour at the center of the fire, which is hurricane strength winds.
Yeah.
At the firestorm's edges, the winds whipped at about 55 miles an hour. So, you know, there's things are kind of burning, the winds are knocking it down, exposing more fuel, which accelerates the burning. As the fire's intensity grew, people began to panic. No surprise there. Running in herds through the streets, the citizens of Tokyo fled the searing heat for any relief they could find. Naturally, they would think of water. Maybe we can cool down in the water. As the people ran through the raging infernos that were once their streets, their clothes burned off their backs. Just due to air temperature, flash burns. Human hair would singe on people's heads as they ran. And Seth, this just gets worse and worse and worse.
It's terrible. It's the descriptions that we're giving and we're going to give don't do it justice. The air was so hot in some places, I kid you not, as high as 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, that water in ponds boiled and canals boiling like rice pots quickly drained themselves of water. The glass, this is terrifying. This is absolutely terrifying to me. I'm sorry. The glass in windows that weren't already broken began to liquefy. The superheated air and cyclonic winds from the firestorm blew the liquefied glass into the air, where it fell on people like some terrible rain, embedding itself into their scalps, where it continued to melt into the hair and skin. Liquid glass. So hot was the superheated air that some people simply burst into flames. Spontaneous combustion. They were running 1 minute, the next minute they were human torches. The Japanese government and military had initially sort of prepared for something like this. They carved these huge fire breaks in the city by just leveling people's homes, but it didn't do any good. The fire was a rolling inferno. The wind coming in now from the southeast whipped the fires into an even bigger frenzy. The fire trucks that were present were immobilized by the human wave that literally rushed away from the Inferno. Over 100 fire trucks simply melted into the streets during the night. As the people fled, like you were saying, Bill, their first instinct pushed them to water. Water, it was thought, would kill the intense heat and protect those who immersed themselves in it from any harm from the roaring flames now sweeping through block after block after block of Tokyo. However, on this night, Bill, water would not be the saving grace.
Yeah, I'm afraid not. An example, Kyoko Kawasaki, a 36-year-old mother, ran into the street with 2 buckets on her head for protection, jogging into the sea of fire and seeing burning bodies floating in the Sumida River. The prostitutes who hung out by the riverbank jumped into a nearby pond, she recalled. But the pond was boiling, so they were all boiled, and they all died. Many sought sanctuary in nearby Sumida River. This ran through the Honjo and Mukojima factory districts and drew many civilians who sought safety in the river. These people who fled could see barely 10 feet in front of them because of the smoke as they ran. So one woman, Funako Kazuyo, recalled, people panicked, running, screaming, we're all going to die, the fire is coming, the sound of incendiary bombs falling, whiz, whiz, the deafening reverberations of the planes, and the great roar of the fire and wind overwhelmed us. If we stay here, we'll die, they said. Let's run. Women and children follow us. Why are you hesitating? Those in the rivers soon began to crush one another from the amount of people jumping in, seeking shelter there. The flames roared across the river, sucking away the oxygen and killing thousands, asphyxiating them, who thought they had reached safety in the water. Some survived by hiding in sewer pipes. Others sought shelter in city parks. The Futaba School was known for its massive swimming pool and large brick buildings. So people flocked to the school, hoping to get into the pool or take refuge in the stone school. The next morning, thousands of corpses were found in the school, not burned, but baked and roasted to death by the heat. Those who found refuge in the pool were no better off. Over 1,000 bodies were counted in the pool, which was full to the top with water the night before, but in the morning was found to be bone dry. The water had simply boiled off and boiled the people who were in it. And so this is, something I'm not sure has ever happened in history before, Seth.
It's like Dante's Inferno. That's what I titled this section of the notes, is Dante's Inferno, because this literally is hell on earth. Quite literally hell. The friggin' ponds are boiling, for crying out loud. In the early daylight hours of March 10th, another B-29 circled Tokyo. Snapping pictures of the strike, the pilot, First Lieutenant Omer Cox, gasped at what he saw below him. Massive patches of scorched earth lay below him, with fire still raging in some areas and most of the area still smoldering. Huge patches of white, which one may have mistaken for snow a couple of days before, lay below him. Scorched white like old pieces of leftover charcoal. Block after block of incendiary Zone 1 lay in absolute ruin. When LeMay looked at the pictures hours later, he leaned over them, studying them. Tapping his finger on the images, he simply said, "This is out, this is out, this is out," over and over again as he looked at the different images. General Lars Norstad looked at the pictures and simply said, "It's all ashes." And it was. The fires had incinerated 15.8 square miles of Tokyo. 267,171 buildings, homes, stores, and factories lay in utter ruin. I'm going to say that again. 15.8 square miles of Tokyo had been incinerated. 267,171 buildings, homes, stores, and factories lay in ruin. Buried in those ruins and laying in the streets like piles of burnt hams were the bodies of some 110,000 people. Another 40,000 were somewhere in those images seeking help for their wounds, Bill. 110,000 human beings in one night.
Yeah, we've said this in several episodes. This killed more people than either of the atomic bombs did, and that needs to be kept in mind. We say repeatedly that it's the innocent in war that suffer most, and this is evidence of that. But I'm not judging. I'm just saying that first of all, we talk about history. We don't judge history, but we do try to learn from these lessons. So the raid had burned 82% of Incendiary Zone 1, 18% of Tokyo's industrial area, and 63% of its commercial district, not to mention the residential district. To put it into American views, LeMay told the press that the raid burned what was the equivalent of the entirety of downtown Manhattan and all of the Brooklyn waterfront. In that same press conference, LeMay issued a chilling warning to the Japanese, saying, "If they persist, I now promise that they have nothing more to look forward to than the complete destruction of their cities." He added later, "If they don't give up, we'll completely devastate their homeland. We will hit them so hard, it will take them a century to recover." Post-war, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded, quote, "Probably more persons lost their lives by fire at Tokyo in a 6-hour period than at any time in the history of man," unquote. More people died in that 6 hours than at any time in the history of mankind. And, evil governments, Seth, expose their people to tactics like these when the opponents have seen no way to avoid it in order to end the war. And this is just, beyond comprehension.
I'm very glad you brought that up. And I knew we were going to get around to it at some point in this conversation, but now's as good a time as any. I want to make sure that people don't misconstrue what we're trying to say here. We're not vilifying American aviators. We're not vilifying American servicemen, nor are we vilifying Curtis LeMay. They did what they had to do. It's a hard thing to say, but it's the truth. When you're faced with, as LeMay was, very clearly was, where he was told by Hap Arnold, if you don't help bring Japan to her knees, like, yesterday, on your shoulders is going to rest, however many hundreds of thousands of American casualties when we have to invade Japan, because the naval blockade is working, but we need to end this like now. We're tired of this crap. It needs to end right now. So therefore, it's your B-29s that are going to bring the war to the home to the empire. Your responsibility. You got to end this. And LeMay did what he had to do because he was not getting results before this. And by God, he got them after this, Jack. Let me tell you. So,
and let's stomp our foot on that point, Seth. The calculus here was 100,000-ish Japanese, I think, is what they predicted, versus 400,000 or 500,000 American troops during the invasion.
No, that was a million. A million Japanese.
Right.
They were saying, yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So, as horrifying as this is, when you're presented with figures like that, it almost becomes a no-brainer. God help us.
Yeah.
This is why. But we need to understand, and we really, really do need to understand the cost of war. In modern terms, this would be even worse.
Oh God,
if this were happening today, because we're way more effective at killing people than we were back then.
Yeah, and another thing I want to bang on, that I want to stomp my foot on this, as you said, it was evil governments. And yes, of course, there were your Japanese civilians who were diehards, who absolutely felt like it was the right thing to do to fight to the bitter end. However, I need to remind people too, this is March of 1945. These people are feeling the sting. They are feeling the sting of not only, we talked a couple episodes ago about Ray Spruance bringing in the carrier airplanes over Japan. So, I mean, these are carrier aircraft. Not that the carrier aircraft are really laying waste to Tokyo, because they're not. But the Japanese are aware these airplanes came from U.S. Navy aircraft carriers. It means the enemy's close. Now the B-29s have been raiding all the time. No, they haven't hit anything until tonight. And then they've wiped out, 18% of the friggin' city in one night and killed 110,000 people. But before any
Yeah.
of that, these guys are starting to starve. This is a very clear thing. The United States Navy submarines had virtually, well, by now, March 45, had pretty much sunk everything that floated. So the Japanese are feeling the sting of the naval blockade, which is what the submarines were doing for all intents and purposes, was a blockade. They're feeling the sting of lack of food. The morale in Japan within the citizenry right now is certainly after this at an all-time low. It's the government that is perpetuating this war. It is the government, the Japanese government, the big six, that are willing to fight to the bitter end because they could care
Fight till the last
less.
Japanese.
Yeah, because they could care less
Fight
about the
till the
citizens.
last.
Don't care.
Right. And I hesitate to point out, we made this point last week, that, let's keep in mind that they're not giving up. I mean,
No.
at Iwo Jima, there were more American casualties than there were Japanese casualties. And so it's not like they're losing every battle at this point. We got Okinawa coming, right? So it doesn't look like they're about to give up and lay down. It's not happening.
Not even close.
So all these things you're going into this calculus. So as terrible as this is, we got to make sure that we understand the world view from what they knew in March of 1945,
Yes.
not what we know today.
100%. Very well put. 100% right. To that end, years later, Curtis LeMay remarked, quote, "These operations were not conceived as terror raids against the civilian population of Japan. But we had to be realistic. We knew we were going to kill a lot of women and kids when we burned that town, but it had to be done," unquote. Now, Bill, this is a conversation we could have from now till Christmas about, arguing for literally days and days and days about how much the bombing campaign influenced the Japanese to surrender. But the proof in our eyes, at least my eyes, lay within the words of the Japanese. I'm not talking about the Big Six. That's a completely different animal altogether. Quote, "Morale stood up as long as plants were bombed." This is from a Japanese civilian. "But when homes and towns were bombed and deaths occurred in families, absenteeism increased and morale became very low. Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki said, quote, "I myself, on the basis of the B-29 raids, felt that the cause was hopeless," unquote. And he was one of the ones that was urging Hirohito to call it quits. Rear Admiral Tata Toshitano said, quote, "Super fortresses were the greatest single factor forcing Japan's surrender." But like you said, Bill, in the notes, but he wasn't a decision maker at that point.
He wasn't. And, yeah, I agree that B-29, but is the B-29 dropping the atomic bomb? Not
Sure.
because the only attempted coup to ever happen during this period of time is a coup to keep them from surrendering, right? So a group of officers staged a coup that even threatened the emperor because they didn't want to surrender. And it was only the atomic bombs that gave them the excuse they needed to save face with the surrender. It was not this firebomb. Yeah, I agree that the civilian morale was in the tank at this point. It couldn't have been worse. They were fleeing the cities because they knew this would continue. But we have no indication that the Big Six were willing to give up. And I said that too many times, I guess.
So, no, I don't think you did, because it's important, because people need to understand. And yes, the point we're trying to make is by doing this episode specifically and singling out this particular raid is, first of all, this was the deadliest air raid in human history. It was, and there's no arguing that. That is an absolute 100% concrete fact. Number two is that even after doing this, which, by the way, this wasn't, as we said last week, this wasn't a one and done thing, man. We didn't do it one time and be like, oh, we're done. Nope. This was actually part of what historians have called Blitz Week, for lack of a better term, initiated by LeMay's 21st Command. And these are the guys, this is a week where we're firebombing every friggin' thing we can lay our fingers on. And it continues after this, by the way. So, I mean, this
until
is
we
not a
run out
one
of bombs.
until we run literally, quite literally, run out of weapons. Exactly. And even then, after we restock, it continues even further. But point being is that even after this catastrophe, absolute, and that's what it is. It's an absolute human catastrophe. The Japanese still weren't gonna friggin' quit. The Tokyo burned for days, days after Meeting House. Human corpses littered the streets everywhere within the target area. Burnt charcoal-like piles on the streets, corners, and inside homes were stark reminders that a human being had burned to death on that very spot. Stacks of corpses, Bill, had melted together to form piles 2 meters high or more and were common sights all throughout the city.
Hmm. Yeah, somebody's going to chime in and say, this isn't the deadliest event in human history. There other diseases killed millions in one fell swoop. A third of the Earth's population was killed by the plague. And all that's true, but not in 6 hours. That's kind of the point we're making. And it
Yes.
wasn't a human event that started it. So the city's river slowed down to a trickle as stacks of dead bodies drifted downstream, clustered together around bridges, and stopped the flow of the river like some hideous, grotesque beaver dam. It would be weeks before Tokyo officials could begin to dispose of the dead and clear the rubble. Post-raid analysis stated that Tokyo's ability to produce war material, or any material really, was cut in half by this one raid. 16 square miles of the formerly bustling capital had been razed to the ground. For the first time, many came to the realization that the war was lost. Their government could feed them all false propaganda, but the fiery writing was literally on the walls. The estimated 110,000 fatalities were all one needed to prove that point. But the war was not over. Japan was preparing for an invasion, recalling troops from Korea and China in order to stave off what they now knew was inevitable: a last stand on Japanese soil. And Seth, one last point. People wonder when they go to Tokyo, or it's also true for Seoul, Korea, why the cities seem so modern? Because everything was destroyed and they basically rebuilt the cities from scratch. It's a horrible way to get your city updated.
You know, I want to make one more point before we wrap this horrible episode up. We talked about leadership. We were talking about the big six just a couple minutes ago, a few minutes ago. Emperor Hirohito, who, by the way, his palace was on the fringes of Incendiary Zone 1. It was not targeted. Could have been, totally could have been. It was on the fringes of Incendiary Zone 1. And there was some damage done to the palace grounds from drifting embers and things like that. That is a fact. Two things, actually, I want to point out. One is that air raid shelters, because people are going to say, where the hell are the air raid shelters? Because there were air raid shelters all over Berlin, all over Bremen, all over, Schweinfurt, and where London, all over the damn place. Any big city that you think is going to be bombed or has been bombed, there are air raid shelters. Where were they in Tokyo? Well, they had some, but, and this is also a fact, the Japanese government, such as it was, did not encourage the digging or building of air raid shelters. Why? Because it would give the impression that the capital could indeed come under attack. No kidding. Not making this up. The government did not encourage the building of air raid shelters for the safety of their populace because it might give a bad impression. No kidding. Hirohito
Yeah.
was so, yeah. Hirohito was so concerned about his citizens. It wasn't until 5 days later that he emerged from his palace grounds. Oh, and by the way, he had an air raid shelter that he and his wife and children were tucked into on that night, by the way. But it wasn't until 5 days later that His Royal Highness decided to tour his devastated capital. And the people that were surviving were so dazed and confused and just so completely out of it that they could have cared less that their so-called God Emperor was rolling through the streets in his Mercedes Benz. Talk about out of touch.
Mhm.
I, I could go on and on
Yeah,
about Hirohito, but I'm not
we,
gonna.
we might
Not
want to
now.
do an episode on Hirohito because I think that, I think the people, there have been presentations in the past, movies and things like that, that presented him as he was being used by
Mm,
the Big Six. That is not true. He was square in the middle of every one of these decisions to continue the
absolutely.
war, to fight the war, to initiate the war. Every one of these decisions. We talked about him a little bit, after Guadalcanal and things like that. But understand, this guy was fully invested in what was going on. He wasn't just a puppet.
Mm-mm.
He was making active decisions, and that's why when that coup happens later, was it August
Hmm.
45,
Yeah.
that they were going after the emperor because they knew he was the decision maker. And
Yeah.
so, there's a lot to unpack in all of this.
There is, and that'll be an episode that we need to do when we get to that point. Is that
Mm,
whole coup, because it's fascinating about all the intricate little details that went down. I mean, it was a pretty
yeah.
near run thing. Do you
Mm.
have anything
No,
else you
you
want to add to this human tragedy?
now you've taken me through another uplifting episode of the unauthorized history of the Pacific War, Seth.
Yeah, that's what we do here, Bill. We bring
It
rainbows
is.
and unicorns every week, every single
Mhm.
week. Good Lord. And wait, it's only going to get worse. I'm just going to tell you guys now. It's only going to get worse. It doesn't get any better at all. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Wherever you receive your podcast, give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this, look at our YouTube channel. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Paradin. I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching to this enlightening and uplifting episode. Bill, bring us home.
And Bill Tody, see you again next week.